Joining me now is Myra Kay, editorial board member and opinion writer for the New York Times, and Kirsten John Foy, Northeast Regional Director of National Action Network, and Tim Weiss, anti-racism activist and author of White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Let me set this up this way. Tim, you were a part of the conversation that we had on race Tuesday night in Philadelphia, and you talked about white privilege. Now, as a white, I'm sure that you get a lot of backlash on that, but we are still dealing in a nation where white privilege is a reality.
Right. And I think it's important to note that when I talk about white privilege, I'm not suggesting that all white people are wealthy or powerful or rich or have material success. When I talk about white privilege, I mean the general day-to-day advantages that generally come from being a member of the dominant group, just like able-bodied privilege or male privilege or moneyed privilege, class privilege. And one of the biggest privileges, and what I was trying to speak to the other night on the special, is the privilege when you're white of not really having to think about your racial identity on a day-to-day basis the way that people of color do, particularly with regard to their interactions with police, their interactions with store owners, their interactions with teachers in the classroom. For people of color, knowing that their racial identity often gives off clues of suspiciousness or incompetence, and being white, being able to take for granted that we are presumed to belong in whatever space we find ourselves. So it's a psychological day-to-day edge that the dominant group has, which I think we have to understand, because that's a burden for those who don't have that edge.
And Amara, it does not mean that you're anti-white or accusing all whites of being racist. It means this is the way the social and cultural landscape is, and you have an advantage that you didn't necessarily even ask for, but you have it if you're white. So if we realize that, how do we deal with it and correct it rather than everybody getting defensive about it?
That's right. I mean, it's about unearned advantages, right? And so if you have an unearned advantage, then by definition, someone else is unfairly disadvantaged. It's not about individual histories. It's not something that people individually are to blame for, but it is something that individuals are responsible for confronting. And I think that the biggest challenge is in getting the defensive walls to kind of come down and to have a conversation in which people don't feel attacked, but we can have an honest conversation about race with the goal of overcoming the history that we have in this country. And if you think about racism as a sickness, as a national sickness, I think that helps, because I think, first of all, it's very honest, but I also think that it allows us to say that, it's not about good people or bad people, right? The country has inherited something, and it's a sickness, and it's toxic. So how do we all work together to overcome it?
Minister Foy, you are the Northeast Regional Director of my civil rights group, National Action Network. I wanted you on because right away, you and the region informed me when I was on the way to Philly that y'all were going in front of ABC to protest around what Roseanne had said. Why was it important to you to gear up and to really respond to this? Because a lot of people get the idea that we, not only National Action Network or me, but other groups, are just sitting around waiting on a crisis.
Right.
What is the reason that you respond to these things? What does it mean to you and a lot of young people? You're a generation behind me, even though I look younger.
That's right. Well, you gave me these grades.
Right.
We're in, and you and I have often talked about this, we are in a time of racial and gender reckoning in America. And it's important for us to affirm our humanity, but it's also important for us to stand around those who have led, those who have put themselves out on the front lines, like Valerie Jarrett, like Susan Rice, like others from our community that make us proud, that have been projecting a different part of Black America to the world, a more positive perspective and view of who we are. So it's important for us to stand up and rally around and protect those who have stood up for us and given us a new image around the world. Valerie Jarrett has done tremendous things along with President Obama to turn this nation around. And if we sit back and allow someone like that, someone like Susan Rice, someone like the First Lady, to just be insulted and dehumanized in silence, then we become a part of the problem.
Tim, I think a lot of people don't understand what Minister Ford just said. The insult, the deep pain that many feel when you can compare Valerie Jarrett, a well-trained, I mean, you couldn't get a more refined American, to an ape.
Right.
It's saying to all of our kids, no matter what you do, you're not going to be anything. I don't
Right.
think people understand how painful that is. That's a lot deeper than, oh, they're just running out there looking for a camera. This
Right.
hurts.
Well, and it's also, we have to keep in mind the historical context because, you know, in the wake of the comments about Valerie Jarrett, a lot of the defenders of Roseanne will make this false equivalence where they'll say, well, you know, people call Donald Trump an orangutan. Well, the difference is there is a history of looking at black folks and comparing them to apes, to monkeys. This is a long-standing racist trope. There is no such trope with regard to white men. So it is obviously historically very different. Now, one may say it's not kind to call the president an orangutan, but it isn't a racialized attack. It does not strike a historical nerve that is directly aimed at the entire community. So we have to put these things in their proper context. There's a history on the one side and not on the other, and it's a false equivalence that we need to be confronting directly when people make those kinds of statements.
You're on the editorial board of the New York Times, Myra, and a lot of us have said things down through the years that we should not have said, and I apologize for it. That goes without saying. But at the same time, I think you have to look at patterns and what people do. And I think that their actions will tell whether or not they really did not represent themselves properly in certain statements. Roseanne's career is built on this kind of stuff, which she still has the right to do. But when you have on publicly regulated networks people that would get those platforms, they should use them more responsibly. And even if they did in the past, they must be very careful then. Isn't that kind of the way the New York Timeses of the world have to kind of look at this evenly when he raises about those that have called the president out of their name? Because I admit in my youth, I used to call people names, including blacks. And I've learned that that is not really, Mrs. Coretta Scott King used to tell me, that's not who you are and quit acting like that, because I worked with her son. But you have to prove that. That's who you are. But people like you have to judge all of us based on the length of your career and where you're going, but also the platforms you're on. She's on a major network regulated by federal government and given advertisers. It's different than somebody standing in a comedy hall.
The context matters. I agree with that. But I also think that we just can't have these conversations without the historical context as well. And I think something that's very interesting that's going on is that while the White House seems to be filled at times, it feels like, with white supremacists or white supremacy, we're seeing in other parts of society a change, and I think you touched on that, and it's a good one. There are real conversations happening, real movement on race in the entertainment world. If you look at what happened to Roseanne, that's accountability. That's the right move. Starbucks, the business world. Sports, the conversation around the NFL and Colin Kaepernick. So I guess what I'm saying is the rest of society is moving forward.
And having that conversation.
And you know what? That conversation, I think, started in some ways anew with Barack Obama. And I think there's a lot of people in this country who were extremely disappointed with the outcome of the 2016 election, and in fact were even more motivated by what they saw from the president who started his campaign calling Mexicans rapists, who made a false equivalency after Charlottesville. So people are even more, people who believe in this vision of what the country can be but hasn't been are even more motivated now than ever.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to keep all of you over. I rarely do that, but let's keep talking about this. Our guests going to stick around, more coming up on racial tensions in Trump America, in Trump's America. We're back with our panel on the weekend, race that was. Let's look at the new NBC poll numbers. 64% of Americans think racism remains a major problem. 45% think race issues are getting worse. And 45% of Americans think racism is getting little attention. Minister Foy, how do you respond to that? Almost 2/3 of Americans still think racism is a problem, even split on those that think it's getting better,
right.
Others thinking it's not getting enough attention. How you're on the front lines, you're in the trenches all over the region, really all over the country. You cheat, but you mostly stay in your region. How do you respond to that poll?
Well, I think those numbers have to be skewed by the fact that if you benefit from white privilege, you're never going to see race as a problem. You're going to always have some barrier between your experiences and the experience of others who are not of the dominant group. But I think that it's clear America is awake to the fact that we are not one. And the Trump administration and this presidency has really exacerbated, issues that have been long, contended with and debated. As you said, the Obama, era, brought one kind of discussion about race,
right.
And the Trump era has taken it and juiced it up, and now we are at a hyper speed and a hyper pace when it comes to race. Everything from the NFL to police accountability to now comedians.
Across the board. Myra, how do you view those numbers?
Well, I think it's interesting because I do feel as though the Trump administration has metastasized something that was already very much there. And I actually think it's a sign of progress that most Americans understand that racism is an actual problem. And I think what has helped that understanding is I think more and more people are seeing that not only is racism toxic to black people, it's toxic to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I don't want to misstate this because black people, minorities have suffered greatly, of course, in the history of this country and continue to in many ways because of racism. But again, if you think about it as a national sickness, to the extent where if you look, the president is able to use, look, I was a politics reporter for many years. It's very clear that the president and his administration will turn to racism as a tool, a political tool for distraction, to divide.
Yeah.
And so I think people see that and they understand.
Tim, let me go to you quickly. Your reaction, we have less than a minute, but I want your reaction.
Sure. I mean, the numbers are interesting, but, let's remember, white America, by and large, has never really seen racism as a problem at the time. We might do it 50 years later, but at the time. So in the early 60s, Gallup polls found that 2 out of 3 or more white Americans thought black folks were already treated equally, and that was before the civil rights laws were even on the books. So my concern is that until white America is willing to acknowledge that black and brown folks know their lives better than we do, and have always known their lives better than we do, and learn to listen to those stories that are behind the numbers, we're not going to make the kind of progress we need to make.
I've been trying to say that a long time, Tim. It's just that I don't say it as well as you are.
Well, thank
Are
you.
you preaching anywhere at the church today? I need to come see you. Thank you, Myra Gay, Kirsten Foy, and Tim Weiss. Up next, my final thought.